I never meant to question the railroads of the United States. They were simply there, like weathered bones of the industrial age, stretching across plains, threading through mountains, linking cities that had once stood as symbols of American confidence. They were progress, or so we were taught. Steel, steam, schedules, and soot. That was supposed to be the whole story. But the deeper you look into the history of these lines, the more something begins to feel fundamentally wrong. Not a small discrepancy, not a quirky footnote, a structural contradiction, the kind that makes you stop, push aside the official narrative, and ask a question most people never think to ask. What if the railroads of America were never meant to be just transportation? What if the tracks and stations that defined a century had another purpose entirely, one that was quietly removed from our history? Start with what we can still see. Grand Central Terminal in New York is supposedly just a place for catching trains. Yet its main concourse stretches 275 feet long, 120 feet wide, and rises to 125 feet at its highest point, all finished in Tennessee marble. Overhead, a 12,000-square-foot celestial mural depicts the Mediterranean night sky, rendered in reverse, with roughly 2,500 gold-leaf stars floating over commuters who never look up. Why would a simple transport facility be built to the scale and symbolism of a temple? Consider Union Station in Washington, D.C. Its Great Hall, with its coffered vaults and gold accents, looks far more like the interior of a ceremonial palace than a waiting room. Or the old Penn Station in New York, demolished in 1963, whose stone colonnades and glass-roofed concourse were so monumental that their destruction helped ignite the historic preservation movement. In city after city, the same pattern emerges. Stations are built with the language of cathedrals, domes, vaults, towers, arcades, not the pragmatic geometry of warehouses or factories. The official explanation blames this on ego and optimism. Railroad barons wanted monuments to their own success, it said, so they commissioned architects to wrap mundane steam-age logistics in classical stone and glass. The Gilded Age loved opulence. Stations simply became the new civic showpieces. It sounds reasonable until you notice how relentlessly repetitive the pattern is. From Boston to St. Louis, from Chicago to Los Angeles, we see the same oversized waiting halls, the same clock towers, the same grand staircases, the same peculiar mixture of overbuilt foundations and delicate decorative detail. It's as if hundreds of companies, allegedly competing and improvising, all followed the same invisible instruction manual. Now, look away from the buildings and down to the ground itself. A railroad track is two parallel steel rails held at fixed intervals, stretching in long, unbroken lines over thousands of miles. Engineers see mechanical support and guidance for wheels. Electricians see something else: paired conductors, forming a primitive yet perfect framework for a continent-scale circuit. If you were going to build a hidden electrical network in the 19th century, long before anyone admitted to having the technology to power a continent, your design would look uncannily like a railroad map. This is where the timeline starts to fracture. By 1890, the U.S. rail network was effectively complete. Major cities were connected, smaller towns were linked, and the web of steel covered the nation. Yet the electrical grid, in the version of history we are given, did not achieve anything like national reach until the 1920s and 1930s. We are told that Edison's direct current systems worked only over short distances, that Tesla's alternating current required massive infrastructure, and that rural electrification lagged far behind urban centers. Somehow, however, the stations along those rails operated as if they lived in a different technological era. Many of the grand terminals had electric lighting from the moment they opened their doors, even while neighboring neighborhoods were still lit by gas lamps and oil. Their interiors, comparable in volume to cathedrals, were heated to comfortable temperatures year-round by radiant systems that, on paper, would have demanded impossible quantities of coal and overwhelming manpower. And yet photographs from the 1890s and 1900s show these buildings uncannily pristine. Hardly any soot, no monumental coal yards, No evidence of the kind of constant smoke and grime that true steam heating on that scale should have produced. The boiler rooms we would expect to find to justify the climate control simply aren't there, not at the proportion the physics would require. When you inspect surviving architectural drawings, the story grows stranger. In numerous major stations, conduits that look suspiciously like electrical channels are embedded into the walls, floors, and foundations from the very beginning, decades before the official arrival of municipal electric service. Rooms are laid out in the size and configuration of modern substations, yet labeled innocuously as storage or mechanical space. You're forced to accept one of two possibilities. Either the architects of the 19th century pre-installed a comprehensive electrical skeleton for systems that supposedly didn't yet exist, or they were adapting, or masking, something that was already there. Then there is the matter of time itself. Before trains, American towns lived by the sun. Noon was when the sun was overhead. Every town's clock could differ by several minutes, and no one particularly cared. That changed in a single stroke on November 18, 1883, when private railroad corporations, not Congress, imposed standardized time zones across the United States. 4 zones, adopted simultaneously and almost immediately accepted by the entire country. For 35 years, until Congress formalized the arrangement in 1918, Americans did not live by natural local time. They lived by railroad time. Work schedules, factory shifts, meal times, even church services began to orbit around an artificial temporal grid defined by the rail network. You can treat this as a mere scheduling convenience, a rational response to the demands of timetables. Or you can consider what it means when a private infrastructure system acquires the power to redefine the way a whole civilization perceives the passage of hours. If you were managing not only trains but energy, if precise synchronization mattered for some deeper, invisible function, such control over time would be invaluable. The railroads did more than move people. They reorganized reality around their own rhythm. By the early 20th century, a puzzle takes shape. Across the continent, you have vast halls that function like resonant chambers rather than simple waiting rooms, rail lines that look as much like paired conductors as transportation corridors, stations wired for power that history insists had not arrived, a temporal system that forces the nation to tick in unison with the rail grid, parallel facts that do not quite touch, unless you entertain the possibility that the official story is only the surface of something older, deeper, and deliberately obscured. Because once you start asking what exactly the rails were truly feeding, you realize the most unsettling question might not be how the trains ran, but what else was silently humming, unseen, along the same lines, and why, within a single generation, that hum seems to have stopped. If American railroads were merely about getting from point A to point B, they chose a very strange way to dress the journey. The most important terminals did not look like factories or machine sheds. They looked like temples that had quietly mislaid their religion. Stand in the main concourse of Grand Central Terminal and try, just for a moment, to forget that the people around you are checking departure boards. What you have is a vaulted space the size of a small canyon, its ceiling painted with a reversed map of Mediterranean constellations, 2,500 gold-leaf stars scattered above a floor of polished Tennessee marble. Light floods in through enormous arched windows, diffused as if the building itself is calibrating the atmosphere. This is not an efficient solution to moving commuters. It is an overqualified solution to something else. Old Penn Station was even more blatant. Before it was demolished in 1963, its steel and glass train shed arched over the platforms like a secular cathedral, while its entrance colonnade rivaled Roman monuments. Photographs from the 1910s show sunlight cascading through a latticework of iron trusses, landing on floors too clean, on walls too untouched by soot, for a supposedly coal-powered age. The building seems designed to handle light and air as if they were materials to be tuned, not inconveniences to be tolerated. Now shift your gaze to Union Station in Washington, D.C. The facade is lined with heroic statues. The entry sequence flows through a vast coffered hall that amplifies sound in curious ways, and the interior is threaded with passages, side rooms, and mezzanines that feel less like straightforward circulation and more like an arrangement of chambers in a machine. You can read it as decoration if you want, or you can ask why a simple terminal needed to behave acoustically like a concert hall and structurally like a power plant. Then there is Union Station in Los Angeles. Officially, it is a late entry, opened in the late 1930s, blending Spanish colonial and Mission Revival styles. Yet its planning echoes older, grander cousins back east. High-beamed ceilings, heavy timber trusses, thick masonry, and oddly proportioned rooms that feel overbuilt for ticket counters and benches. When you look at the beams, the patterned wood, the metal fixtures, a different reading emerges. The building begins to resemble a resonant instrument, one capable, perhaps, of interacting with fields we no longer bother to measure. Consider how these buildings plugged into their surroundings. Major terminals were almost always the central nodes of their cities, not just geographically, but electrically and temporally. Power lines converged near them. Telegraph and later telephone lines spilled out from their vicinity. The synchronized clocks that defined railroad time were mounted on their walls and towers, broadcasting standardized hours to anyone within sight. In practice, these were not mere train sheds. They were urban control centers, distributing something far more subtle than tickets. Look closer at the physical details that conventional history brushes past. Many of the grandest stations were equipped with radiant heating systems capable of warming volumes measured in hundreds of thousands of cubic feet, maintaining comfortable temperatures even in harsh winters. According to the standard story, this feat was achieved with coal-fired boilers and steam pipes. Yet the infrastructure we should find to support that story, massive boiler halls, titanic smokestacks, endless coal bunkers, elaborate ash removal systems, rarely appears at the scale their claimed output would demand. What we do see, over and over, are mysterious sub-basements, sealed corridors, and mechanical rooms that appear far more deliberate and self-contained than improvised steam plants. Blueprints that survive sometimes reveal something more troubling: electrical conduits embedded in concrete from day one, shafts and channels running vertically through towers and domes, aligning with ornamental features that look surprisingly like antennae. Rooms placed exactly where a modern engineer would put transformers or switching gear, yet labeled in the records as storage, baggage, or general utility. In some cases, stations show documented electrical consumption at levels that do not match the known capabilities or the documented existence of nearby power plants at the time. If you treat the stations as part of an energy system instead of just transport, the architecture begins to make a different kind of sense. The high vaults and domes become potential resonance cavities. The extensive use of metal, copper roofs, iron trusses, bronze fixtures, begins to look like an intentional conductive framework. The thick stone foundations and deep basements behave like grounding structures. The twin steel rails entering and exiting the building, perfectly spaced and continuous for miles, resemble long conductors feeding or drawing something invisible through the landscape. Transport becomes the visible byproduct. Transmission becomes the hidden function. Grand Central, Penn, Union. These start to read less like endpoints and more like hubs in a network. Imagine them as energetic lungs, breathing power in and out along the rails. The trains we remember, the locomotives, the passenger cars, could simply have been the most obvious things moving through a system that was built to carry something else entirely: charge, frequency, resonance, information embedded in fields rather than in paper timetables. Then notice what happens after the 1920s. The era of super grand stations ends. New construction shifts to more modest forms: Art Deco boxes, concrete shells, simpler roofs, utilitarian layouts. Some of the old cathedrals are demolished, others are gutted and renovated, their mysterious guts replaced with modern HVAC and wiring. It is framed as an evolution in taste and technology. Yet viewed through another lens, it looks like the dismantling of a network, the quiet retirement of buildings whose original function had either become unnecessary or too inconvenient to explain. If these were truly just monuments to steam and steel, their excess would be an architectural curiosity and nothing more. But when you align their forms, their placement, their embedded infrastructure, and their role in reorganizing time itself, a more provocative possibility emerges. The great stations of America may have been the visible crowns of an invisible grid, their marble concourses merely the public lobbies of a power system that ran through the very rails beneath our feet. If the great American terminals were the crowns of a system, then the rails themselves were its veins. On paper, they were simple. Two lines of steel, spaced just far enough apart to cradle the flanged wheels of locomotives, held in place by wooden ties and spikes. In reality, they formed something far more interesting. A continent-spanning lattice of paired conductors installed with an obsessiveness that makes more sense for a grid than for mere transport. By 1890, the United States had woven millions of miles of these metal pathways across its body. Steel lines reached every major city and bled outward into small towns that, in many cases, had little economic justification for such heavy infrastructure. A place with a few thousand residents might receive a station large enough to process an equal number of people at once, and a fanning pattern of rails that felt more like an electrical design diagram than a pragmatic logistics plan. The railroad companies called it ambition. From another angle, it looks like something trying very hard to ensure that no significant patch of land remained electrically isolated. Think about the physical properties of a rail line. Two conductive strips, kept at a fixed distance, continuous for miles, and anchored into the earth at regular intervals. In modern engineering, parallel conductors like that can function as a crude transmission line, capable of carrying current or oscillating fields along their length. If those rails were tied, at certain nodes, into the masonry, metalwork, and copper roofs of the big terminals, you begin to see the outline of an integrated system. The stations as capacitors and resonators, the rails as waveguides, the landscape itself as part of the circuit. Now, layer on top of that the imposition of standardized time. Before railroads, local noon was sacred, literally, in many communities. The sun reached its peak, and clocks followed. The moment private rail corporations declared that natural time was obsolete and railroad time would rule instead, something subtle but profound happened. Human activity began to tick in lockstep with a man-made schedule. Not just departures and arrivals, but factory shifts, office hours, school days, and eventually even sleep patterns synchronized to a grid defined by the rails. For moving passengers, such precision is convenient. For running a hidden energetic system, it could be essential. If you were trying to maintain stability across a network that depended on pulses, cycles, or waves, you would want the human-created disturbances, loads, demands, mechanical operations, to occur in predictable rhythms. The timetables would do double duty. On the surface, they would choreograph travel. If you accept, even as a thought experiment, that the rails functioned as more than mechanical guides for wheels, other anomalies begin to feel less like coincidences. Stations consuming enormous amounts of energy before nearby official generation exists. Architectural blueprints anticipating power long before municipal utilities. A society that, with no centralized governmental order, allows private companies to redefine time itself in a single coordinated act, and then lives by that artificial beat for generations. The story we've inherited tells us that steel, coal, and steam built the modern United States, and that electricity arrived later as a natural escalation. But the physical evidence hints at another order entirely. First, a synchronized lattice of metal laid across the continent. Then, monumental hubs designed like resonant organs. And only afterward, an official narrative that explains all of this as mere logistics and civic pride. It's a story that accounts for every ticket sold and every locomotive fired, but not necessarily for everything that moved along those gleaming lines of steel. Because if the rails were, in fact, a buried grid, if trains were simply the most obvious things riding a more subtle current, then the real question is not how America was connected, but what exactly was flowing along those connections before we rewrote the script to say it was only us. If the rails were veins and the great halls were crowns, then the basements of America's stations were the hives, the places where whatever the system truly did was gathered, shaped, and sent back out. Yet, in most official accounts, those spaces barely exist. They are footnotes, service levels, mechanical rooms, storage. For buildings that size, handling the volumes they supposedly handled with the technology they allegedly had, that silence is deafening. Walk into almost any old American depot that has survived with its bones intact, and you feel a strange dissonance. Above ground, the architecture is performative. Grand arches, tall windows, clock faces staring down from towers that seem slightly too large for the towns they govern. But go down a level, when you can, and the mood shifts. Ceilings get lower, corridors narrower, walls thicker. You find blind doorways bricked over, staircases leading nowhere, and rooms whose proportions make no sense for baggage, ticketing, or offices. They feel like components in a machine whose manual has been burned. Consider the scale of the climate control problem these buildings allegedly solved with simple steam. A terminal like those in Chicago or St. Louis had to keep hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of air habitable through winters that froze the surrounding countryside. That would have required enormous boilers, fuel stores, flues, vents, and constant maintenance. Yet period photographs show polished floors, clean ceilings, and interiors that don't bear the scars of decades of coal smoke and soot. Where, exactly, did all that heat come from? Where exactly did all that exhaust go? When you study old floor plans that have escaped renovation, you sometimes see patterns that don't match the official story. Long, straight service corridors running parallel to the platforms, lined with evenly spaced chambers. Vertical shafts that line up with towers, domes, or decorative finials above. Clusters of rooms at the exact places where rails enter the building, as though something was meant to be intercepted or transformed at the threshold between outside track and interior hall. Whoever laid these out seemed less concerned with storage efficiency than with geometry. Small-town depots echo these same choices in miniature. A community of 5,000 might get a brick station with a tower, a high-ceilinged waiting room, and an unexpectedly deep foundation. Beneath the ticket office, there might be a narrow cellar with thick walls and a single, massively overbuilt column. Officially, that's just prudence. Good building practice in an unstable climate. But when the same pattern shows up again and again, from New England to the Plains to the West Coast, it starts to look less like prudence and more like a standardized template for nodes in a larger network. Imagine, just for a moment, that these lower levels were not afterthoughts, but the main event. The rails brought something into the building. Not just trains, but current, charge, or resonance carried by the metal lines themselves. That energy pooled in the basements, distributed through channels embedded in masonry, rose through towers and domes, and interacted with the carefully proportioned volumes of the waiting halls above. The passengers would feel only the comfort, consistent temperature, clean air, soft light. The machinery doing the real work would hum below their feet, unremarked and unnamed. This would help explain why, when modernization came, it so often attacked the hidden parts first. Renovations in the mid-20th century ripped out obsolete infrastructure and replaced because if all that hidden infrastructure was truly just overbuilt steam plumbing and extra storage, its removal would be a footnote. Instead, it feels like the missing center of a story whose edges we still walk through every time we stand on a platform, listening to a train arrive on rails that may have once carried far more than wheels. By now, the American rail network starts to look less like an isolated invention and more like a branch of something wider, an appendage hooked into a system whose origins may not lie in the United States at all. When you compare U.S. rail hubs with those overseas, a strange feeling settles in. Everyone, everywhere, seems to have been building to the same invisible spec sheet. Look at the timing. Between the mid-1800s and the early 1900s, cities on every inhabited continent erupt with remarkably similar rail architecture. New York unveils Grand Central. London expands its great termini. Berlin, Paris, Vienna, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Melbourne, Tokyo, and Cape Town all raise what are essentially the same type of building: grand multi-nave halls, iron and glass vaults, stone facades with towers, and deep, mysterious substructures. These are nations with different languages, religions, and political systems, but somehow they all arrive at nearly identical forms within a tight 60-year window. The conventional explanation leans on fashion. Architects copied one another. Engineers shared best practices. Styles spread along with telegraph lines and trade. There is truth in that, but fashion does not usually penetrate this deeply into structure. Decorative styles migrate easily. Concealed mechanical logic does not. Yet, when you peel away the ornament, the inner logic of many of these stations is eerily uniform. Their halls are tuned to similar proportions, their towers and domes occupy similar relative positions, and their tracks enter and exit in patterns that mirror one another like variations on a single theme. This uniformity extends beyond architecture into behavior. Time standardization, which Americans sometimes treat as an odd national quirk, happened in parallel overseas. Rail companies in Europe, Asia, and the colonies push their societies away from local solar time toward artificial railway time, often decades before any government codifies it. The mechanism differs, but the effect is the same. Populations begin to live by a grid of human-made hours tied directly to the rail network. In other words, the system doesn't just move bodies, it rewrites the temporal software of entire cultures. If the U.S. network were purely homegrown, we might expect American stations and tracks to exhibit a distinctly national logic, shaped primarily by domestic needs and ideas. Instead, they fit almost seamlessly into a global pattern. Large hubs echo the design of their European counterparts. Smaller depots copy scaled-down details seen in cities half a world away. This is not what independent invention looks like. It looks more like a rapidly rolled-out platform. One template, localized skins. That impression deepens when you consider the way supposedly new industrial nations seem to leap straight into high sophistication. Many American stations open with advanced features: large-span roofs, refined ventilation, provision for heavy electrical loads, despite being built in cities that, at the time, barely had basic utilities for housing. In effect, the public infrastructure for trains looks more advanced than the domestic infrastructure for the people riding them. That's the opposite of how technological evolution normally proceeds. Usually, you see small-scale experimentation first. One unsettling possibility is that the U.S. rail system was never meant to be a standalone creation. It may have been conceived, or adapted, from an older, more global design whose traces linger in the masonry and alignments of grand stations worldwide. In that scenario, America did not invent a new way to wire its continent. It plugged into an existing pattern, extending a network it barely understood. Engineers and architects would have drawn on what they were taught, standards, rules of thumb, good practice, without necessarily knowing where those standards originated or what deeper purpose they once served. This would help explain why documentation is so strangely thin, exactly where you'd expect it to be rich. For many of the largest American terminals, we have beautiful renderings of facades, careful sketches of ornament, and endless commentary on stylistic choices. But when you go looking for detailed internal schematics of the original mechanical and if that's true, even partly true, it casts the forbidden energy of the railroads in a new light. Maybe what was forbidden was not a new discovery, but the public acknowledgement that much of what we call progress was built on top of something older. Something that made our grandest stations look more like reclaimed power temples than brand new train sheds. Something that turned rails into covert conductors, time into a tuning signal, and America into one more node in a network whose original architects no longer sign their names on our blueprints. If you trace the story to its edge, you arrive at an uncomfortable possibility. The true railroad system of the United States may never have fully disappeared. It may simply have been downgraded, disguised, and forgotten, its most spectacular functions switched off while its physical skeleton remains, rusting quietly beneath a new narrative. We know the visible part of the story by heart. The age of steam gives way to diesel and electric locomotives. The automobile and the airplane steal passengers. Grand stations are demolished or repurposed. Freight traffic consolidates onto fewer lines. The old timetables vanish into archives. Yet, through all of that, the rails themselves remain, not as dense as they once were, but still there. Twin strips of steel following the same ancient rights of way, entering the same older terminals, touching the same foundations that were overbuilt long before anyone could justify them with ticket sales. Walk through a surviving 19th or early 20th century station today, and you feel a double exposure. On one layer, you see the modern retrofit. LED signs, kiosks, HVAC grills, security cameras. On the deeper layer, you glimpse the older logic. A dome whose acoustics are too perfect for chance. A series of columns whose spacing feels more like a wavelength than a whim. A tower whose height and alignment echo a pattern repeated in cities thousands of miles away. The building is still doing something. We've just decided that something is only aesthetics. Out along the lines, the pattern persists. Rails slice across fields, cling to river valleys, burrow through mountains and tunnels that seem oversized for the traffic they now carry. Small towns whose populations have shrunk or shifted still possess brick depots with foundations that refuse to crack, towers that have no practical modern function, and basements that locals will tell you are weird without quite knowing why. It's as if the country is dotted with sleeping organs, components of a system that once did more than shuffle freight. What would it mean if the rails still form a latent grid? Not necessarily one pulsing with some exotic energy we can't measure, but a geometrically precise, electrically capable framework embedded in the land. One answer is mundane. It would simply be an untapped asset, a relic of overbuilding. Another answer is more provocative. The grid might still be used, just at a fraction of its original capacity and under a different logic. Modern signaling systems already use the rails as conductors for low-voltage circuits. Certain detection systems rely on currents through the track to sense trains. In a very narrow sense, the idea of rails as electrical paths never went away. It was just collapsed into purely functional, minimal use. But the architecture of the old hubs, those cathedrals of stone, glass, and iron, suggests they were designed to interact with something richer than a few signaling circuits. Their volumes, materials, and alignments feel optimized for resonance, not just occupancy. If that is true, then turning off the original system would have felt less like flipping a switch and more like silencing an instrument. The rails would keep carrying trains, the buildings would keep sheltering passengers, the deeper, more enigmatic function would simply stop being fed. Why shut it down? One simple answer is control. A widely distributed, building-based energy system that uses architecture and rails as its backbone would be difficult to meter, tax, or centralize. Consolidating power into dedicated plants and wires, and rewriting history to say that's how it always had to be, creates a world where energy is a product, not a property of the built environment. Under that model, the grand stations become too big, too expensive, obsolete, and their most puzzling features are quietly demolished, bricked over, or dismissed as eccentricities of a bygone style. Another answer is more unsettling. What if by the time the United States fully embraced the railroad, no one actually remembered how to operate the system at its original capacity? Architects and engineers might have inherited fragments, rules about proportions, materials, and alignments, without the underlying theory. They could build structures that fit the pattern, plug them into the rails, and observe useful but diminished effects. Efficient heating, cleaner air, inexplicably low soot. Enough to impress, not enough to understand. When newer technologies emerged, the remnants of the older system were simply folded into them, stripped of their mystery, and eventually discarded. Either way, the result is the same. The American you inhabit today is layered over an older map. Rails that still trace long, straight, conductive paths through the land. Stations whose shapes and foundations hint at lost, energetic intent. Cities whose rhythms were once locked to railroad time and never fully shook the habit. You can treat all of this as coincidence, an overreading of industrial exuberance. Or you can allow, at least as a thought experiment, that the United States may be living inside the carcass of a more ambitious infrastructure, one that viewed rail not just as a way to move bodies, but as a way to shape fields, synchronize minds, and quietly reorganize reality along lines of steel. If that's even partly true, then the phrase forbidden energy of the railroads stops sounding poetic and starts sounding literal. The energy isn't forbidden because it never existed. It's forbidden because acknowledging it would force a rereading of everything the rails touched. Industry, architecture, timekeeping, even national identity. It would mean that the story of American ingenuity is missing a chapter in which the greatest monuments of the rail age were not merely shrines to steam, but the last, loud echoes of a technology we chose, or were persuaded, not to remember.